Hi, I'm VerBurg, and our topic is self-acceptance. Before we proceed with the little seminar booklet that we have, I would like to make a comment on the topic itself. Perhaps it's the kind of language you're used to using, maybe it isn't, but basically is what our topic of self-acceptance involves is how we feel toward ourselves. You know, we spend a lot of time in life trying to perfect this of how we feel toward others, how we treat others. In fact, within the Christian church and the Christian community, a good deal of emphasis is placed on our relationship with each other. It has often struck me how little attention and how little time we give to our own particular self. I often get somewhat of the impression that goes something like this: God created everybody but me. Or to turn it around, something like this: everybody in the world is important except myself. What we are going to be doing in this topic is going to come right down to home. In fact, I would like to say this: if you can handle things with yourself, and if you can maintain a good attitude or relationship within yourself, you can handle any situation that comes along in the world. First of all, being born again, Christ gives us the principle and also the power of the new life. But in order for that power to become a dynamic in our lives amongst people, it is important that that power connect within our own life first. Then, in proportion to how we are able to handle it with ourselves, will determine how we will be able to handle it with others. I do not wish to make too many comments right at this point in introducing our topic. However, I would like to say that here is an area that enters into all the relationships of life. Counseling with parents who have difficulty with children, one of the places where everything seems to break down or come to an end in the home is when the parent finally loses confidence in themselves. I have noticed it again and again in marriage counseling, and have often phrased it this way: marriages seem to go down difficult roads with many problems, but it seems at the point where the man or the lady feels it's time to leave the marriage relationship is when they are beginning to lose confidence within themselves. And the thought is usually expressed this way: I believe I better get out of the marriage before I go down with it. I guess I'd like to just turn that around just a little bit and say, if we can handle it within ourselves, there is no situation in life so difficult that we cannot handle or that we cannot stay in. Jesus is the finest example I can think of. He walked a difficult road in his ministry. He walked a lonely road. But, to put it this way, he had it put together within himself. And as a result of this, Jesus could take it to the end, even through the death on the cross. You'll take your little seminar booklet. Is what I'm going to do is work our way through it page by page, and let me say this: I certainly hope that you don't linger on a page, even though the material may seem ever so interesting. When I say to you, let's go to the next page, let's do that. You can always go back and rework the material. I'd also like to ask that you do not move ahead of me, but let's just stay together, and suppose that we're sitting face to face in the room, and just keep paging our booklet as we go, and from time to time I will tell you what page I'm on so that you can keep your booklet on the same page. Now on page 2. There, the purpose of this booklet is to enable you to experience abundant living in one area of your life, namely self or self-acceptance. like to make a comment or two on this so that I can start you thinking and you can develop your thoughts on this. But the point that I would like to put before you is Jesus came to give us the abundant life, but sin has so entangled so many minds and lives today that for us to just suddenly connect and put it all together often is very difficult. I have often noticed when people give testimonies, especially those who have come to the Lord later in life, who have had enough time for enough sin and enough waywardness in life that they could sadly entangle themselves in sin. Let me illustrate. I'm thinking of an individual who was married, had 4 children, had a very fine family, had a thriving business, and was well on his way to success and prosperity. Alcohol entered his life, and as a result of this, he soon became a slave to it. As time went on, he began to squander some of the profits of the business. The result of this being, it wasn't long, his business went downhill. As his wife could see what was happening to the business as well as himself, the family fell apart, and as things deteriorated and his world fell apart, the man soon discovered one day that walking without the Lord and walking in sin had destroyed much of his life. In fact, almost everything he ever had to live for. About that time, a Christian reached him, and he became a Christian. And the result was he looked about himself and said, "Now, I have Christ. I should have all this happiness. But I have tangled with sin, and sin has entangled me for so long. My wife is gone. My children have forsaken me. My credit rating is gone. My business I have no longer. What have I?" We're living in a time when discipleship is a very needed art in the Christian community. But we are also living in a time when if a person is going to disciple someone, he is going to have to know how to understand and help people so sadly defeated through the different encounters that they have had in life. I would like for us to gather up a few facts and understanding of what is a person. Who are we? Turn the page. I have a rather simple illustration there. It looks something like a stick. I really intended it to be something like a pipe. And the idea of this pipe, by putting God on the top and the world on the bottom, was to illustrate how that man is intended to be the channel or the instrument through which God could pass his wisdom and knowledge into this world. When God finished his creation and placed the first people on this earth, Adam and Eve, everything was in perfect harmony. Disobedience had not set into their lives. The world was still in harmony with heaven itself, and man was a fine channel through which God could work. As we turn to the next page, there are a few things here that I would like for us to turn back to get a feel for. And the reason that I like to do this is because I've often believed that sin has so tainted and so distorted our lives and our minds that we have come to accept it as a normal way of life. In fact, I believe many people look at their broken lives and look at this broken world and assume that it's normal. For that reason, I would like to single out just a few things here that kind of remind us of what a beautiful purpose and plan God originally had for man. First of all, God gave you life so that you can live. Did you ever stop to think of that? Life was given with the purpose and the intention that we would live it and live it to the fullest. As we look in the world around us, we see the abuse of drugs, the use of drugs. We see the usage of alcohol. We see the reckless living, suicides. We need reminding from time to time that life was given to us with the intent that we should live. The world today is so darkened in sin and has so lost its way that it seems to look upon the scene of life as though it were intended to be a scene of death. The next point. God created you so you could create. Did you ever think of that? How many people are standing still? How many people go through life never came near what God intended them to be? How many people go through life with the attitude that life is nothing more than just a treadmill of monotony and a scene of repetition? God made us to create. Creating people generally are dynamic people. They're happy people. They have something to live for, and tomorrow there will be still more to create, to explore, to improve. These are some of the drives that God, in His own way and in His own likeness, placed and intended that we use in our lives. But once again, due to sin in the world and man's sorry attitude toward himself, he seems to have more success in learning ways to destroy rather than to build up. A third point, and many more points could be made, I just mentioned 3, and that is God made you in His likeness so you can be like Him. I think every Christian and every person from time to time should go out under the stars at night and look up into the beauties of heaven and see there the handiwork of God untouched, and should ask himself the question, if my life aspired in any way, shape, or form to what God intended it to be, what would it be? Now as we turn the page, we see that something happened. We realize that man fell into sin. And if you can picture a little piece of pipe bent over, you will notice that the inside of the pipe always kinks back. Take, for instance, the straw through which children often drink their pop. You bend that little straw, it sort of pops out on the two sides and the center folds in, and if they bend it over the edge of the cup sharply or the tumbler, nothing can come through because the flow is restricted and shut off. Well, when man rebelled against God, he cut off his God-given potentials. God is still in the picture. The world is still in the picture. But when we see what sin did to man, we can see how he cut off his usefulness and his purpose. Thus God made himself useless and without purpose. I have an illustration on the next page which illustrates what I see within my own mind of what has happened to man in this kinked, sinful position, which I think well characterizes the world today. I have this line going across the page, and on top of the line to the left I have the world of reality, and underneath the line I have the world of fantasy. Then I have man, and I have a problem, and the arrows of the problem point down, and I'm assuming that here is a person who feels within himself he has no self-worth. Now, as you note, life presents a problem which always contains pressure, and as man encounters it, the natural way for man to go is to be pushed out of the world of reality into sort of a world of fantasy and dream and denial. Or, as I've summarized it for you, because of sin, you lost your ability to face life's problems. Thus you escape through lying, drinking, stealing, drugs, and hatred. All of these are attempts to establish self-worth through a false means. Stop and think carefully. Man, with all his beauty, how when sin entered into the world, he just shut those possibilities off and made his life useless. That's not the end of the story, though. We turn the page, and now I'm on page 8. When Jesus came into the world to restore man in his lost condition, and this applies to those who accepted him and believed on him, we notice that man as a channel once again has some of his potentials restored, even though there's still the weakness left within him. Jesus came into the world to give you new life, and through it he restores your usefulness and purpose. I can't think of a better way to summarize and say what people are looking for today than to say that deep down inside the heart, the mind, and the lives of people, they're looking for usefulness. They're looking for purpose. What happens when you take the usefulness out of a person? He has nothing to live for. What happens when you take his purpose away? Aimlessness. Just something like going in circles. Something like watching the sun come up and the sun set, and see it rise and set again, and see it rise and set again. How I often think this characterizes the lives of many children where homes are too busy. It characterizes the lives of many teenagers where the homes have neglected them. How it characterizes many people in the midst of life who could be in the productive years of life, but who feel there's no use, there's nothing to be gained. And then I think of the untapped energies and all the gifts and experience and abilities of the older people of our race. Many of them looking out of the window, just merely cycling through the routines of life. Many of them with no more on their mind than just waiting to die. Often Christians alike. Well, the last point I mention on this page, I believe, is important. The fall left you weak and incapacitated, spiritually, physically, and emotionally. But let me make a comment on that. The point that I believe that we ought to realize is there's a general tendency in the average Christian to spend his time talking about weaknesses rather than strengths, using the little phrase, if only, instead of asserting himself and saying, I'll put something where there's nothing. Have you ever stopped to think how many good ideas have been suggested, have been put together in the minds of men that have never come to pass because when somebody said, you know what I think could happen, the idea was tested in the form of how it couldn't work and why it very likely wouldn't work. As a result, the idea was completely discarded. Nobody ever knew if it could have worked because nobody ever tried it. When somebody comes up with a good idea, why not just build on it and see if it could work? I want to say something else about that kinked condition that still remains in man. You know, Jesus restores us back to beauty. We aren't perfect in ourselves, of course not. And our lives aren't flawless, of course not. But there is something that Satan likes to do to Christians, and that is always remind them of gifts and abilities that they don't have and mistakes that they've made. Then for them to go on and grow and live in the Spirit of the Lord in the things they can do because of the gifts they do have, and to be able to develop in the areas where God has given them potentials. I've often seen this at work in churches. A pastor, for instance, is very gifted in expounding the Word from the pulpit. Tremendous Bible teacher. But he's not all that strong in visitation. And usually after the honeymoon is worn off and people have gotten used to him, they're all through bragging about all those good sermons they've been getting. It's about time now that they get around to the things he doesn't have, and so the visitation's a little weak, and you usually hear the cry something like this. You know, we have a tremendous pastor, and he really can put out the sermons, but you can't live without being visited. We have to get a pastor here sometime who visits. This man just doesn't visit. And so they take the one quality he doesn't have, and that becomes his whole ministry. And what they're really saying is maybe in a year or two we can get him the idea that he should leave. So by and by he leaves. He feels like he can't do the church a great deal of good anymore. The pulpit committee gets together, or however they go about selecting a pastor, and they say, what kind of a pastor do we need? And everybody says, we need a man who can really, really visit. Boy, we need our visit. So, okay, they find a man who can really visit, and while the honeymoon is on for about a year, everybody is so excited about the way this man comes out and visit. But, you know, it isn't very long, and somebody says, you know, that visiting is nice, but you have to have something to eat on Sunday, too. And so they start talking up the weakness. The one gift he doesn't have, they start talking it up. He isn't bad there, but it's a little weak. And they keep it up until finally he leaves, and then what are they going to get? Well, now the pulpit committee is going to make sure that they get a man who can really preach the Word and forget about the visiting and just keep it going. That just seems to be what happens constantly. God never intended that we with our redeemed lives should keep on grooving on the things we don't have and the gifts and abilities that are absent. But God intended that we should dwell on the positive and the potentials. Across the page I have that line and that similar illustration, and in it you can simply see how that when a person has self-respect and self-worth, he is able to fight back, resist the problems and pressures of life, walk through to solve them, and go on to abundant living. That's why in John 10:10 we read the words of Jesus when he said, I've come to give you abundant life. And I like to say it this way, Jesus came and dwells within us and gives us something to fight back with. Life no longer needs to be our master, but we can be the masters of life. And when Jesus said he came to give us abundant life, this includes our life both in time and eternity. If we turn the page, there's something else I would like to point out that's very pertinent to the Christian life. And that is that the conflict within many Christians is that they hear Satan telling them that they are no good. And, of course, this is very consistent with humility. If you're really humble, you will stay convinced you are no good. Well, I look at the church in its humility, if that's what you call it. I would rather call it a grounding and say Satan has them all sitting on the bench with their mouths shut, really feeling sorry for themselves because nobody is any good. Sad commentary, isn't it? But God's message through Jesus is one of acceptance and approval. He simply says you have great value. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6. If my Father can feed the birds, and something as cheap as sparrows how much more will he take you and supply all your needs? For are you not more valuable than a whole flock of them? You get the connection. The important thing is that you accept yourself and forgive yourself the way God does, and live with your eyes to the future. God forgives and forgets. Can you? In the following steps, I'm going to show you a simple plan through which you can become victorious in all of this, and I'm on page 12 now, the beginning of the pyramid. I'm first going to show you the top of the pyramid, the goal that we're striving for, and that is purpose. Purpose. No man in Christ was ever intended to merely breathe air and mechanically go through the routines of life. We have a purpose. God has put each of us here as connecting links in a tremendous plan. Doesn't that thrill your heart? You count. People often sit in the pew in a church and they say, but the only way I could count is if I were the pastor in the pulpit. But to whom would the pastor speak if there were no one in the pew? So if the pastor is going to speak with a purpose, there has to be someone listening. You see how important it is that these two tie together, the pulpit and the pew? The pastor preaches, the congregation prays. The pastor gives of himself to his ministry. The congregation makes a ministry of giving so the pastor can keep giving of the ministry. These all flow together in beautiful purpose. Across the page again, I singled out a few things that we can say about purpose. One, and that is when there is purpose in life, there is self-respect. In other words, I have to live, I want to live, because I have some important things to do. And I'm the man to do it. There's a calling in it. Number two, a person who has purpose also has direction. It's a beautiful thing to see a person build in life in such a way that every day finally weaves together a life of significance. He's going someplace. And thirdly, within it, there are not only goals or objectives, but meaningful goals. I like to believe in my own life, for instance, that if I did not give myself to my task and my calling in life, somehow or another, it would affect you in such a way that your life would be a little more difficult without me. But if I got acquainted with you and took the time to find out your purpose in life, I'm sure of one thing. Somehow, without you, my life would be a little more difficult too. You see, for life to reach these lofty heights, it is necessary for us that we not only work together, but that we build this step by step. Now we're going to just go through the steps of the pyramid. On page 14, we have the first step, and once again, it's very important that we build the base and work our way up. Now, it might seem a little bit strange to you that we have the word communication in there, and that communication means dealing with yourself. People, when they see that, quite often ask me the question. They say, well, does that mean that I talk to myself? And I always say to them, sure, go ahead, as long as nobody catches you. There's something very interesting about that in life. I think just about everybody talks to themselves. I hope they do, or I just gave quite a disclosure about myself, didn't I? But I find that most people, I ask the question honestly and say, do you ever talk to yourself? Do you talk out loud? And they say, yes, I do. And I say to them, does it have an impact in your life? Well, yes. And then I like to say to them, do you ever compliment yourself? And then they sort of blush all over. You see, this doesn't fit into Christian humility. And they say, well, are you kidding? And I say, why not? And they say, well, what good would it do? What good would what do? For me to compliment myself. Well, I'd say, well, wouldn't it encourage you and make you feel better? And they kind of smile a little bit, and some people blush, and they say, are you kidding? So then I say to them, do you ever scold yourself? Oh, yes. Do you ever condemn yourself? I should say so. Do you ever shame yourself? Oh, yes, I do. And I say, does it make you feel worse? Oh, absolutely it does. You see the point? There's a powerful language that goes on inside us. There's a world of communication in there. It has a tremendous influence and a tremendous effect in our lives. Yet what we don't see is that the positive would be just as helpful and influential and powerful as what the negative is adverse. When is the last time you complimented yourself? The next point is, in dealing with yourself, it is important that you see all of yourself and not just what you want to see. For every part of you is you and equally important. I think we have to spend a minute here to reflect and ponder this thought. In dealing with yourself, it is important that you see all of yourself. Now, I've spent many years in the counseling room, and I have found so many times that is what people like to do is go back and find the things that are of worth or value in their life. And there are usually just a few things back there that are a little shabby and regretful. And they try to suppress and put those out of their mind and put them away. It's too bad. I don't know how old you are, but why don't you just add up the years that you've been here on this earth and stop and think how many things you've been involved in. And really, when it comes down to it, you haven't made all that many mistakes, but you remember those few mistakes more than all the good efforts and labors that you have asserted yourself on. And yet, you compliment yourself so little. And finally, you drive a wedge within yourself, where you condemn yourself and throw away just about everything for a little bit of bad. It's certainly not the way of forgiveness. It's certainly not Jesus' way of dealing with broken lives, is it? What's the good of this thorough understanding of ourselves? We'll turn the page. You notice that it's for the sake to understand. So I understand me inside and out. To overcome your critical attitude toward others, like your husband, your wife, your children, your friends, you must first gain victory over your own feelings of inadequacy. I believe that is what makes critical people so critical of others, is that they are so down in themselves and they hurt so terribly on the inside that finally they look at others around them and say, you have no right to smile either, and I'm going to make sure that you have no cause to smile for. And there comes criticism. It is important for you to understand that you are not perfect and that God does not expect you to be perfect. What a paradox. You need Christ to save you, and then you want to go on and save yourself and exclude Him completely. Turn the page to acceptance. And we find there that acceptance is when you are able to face both the good and the bad of your past and realize God's acceptance of yourself implies all of this. May I say to you, in a way that perhaps you won't forget, isn't it a bit insulting when God comes along who knows our hearts in and out, looks down in tender love and says, I accept you. I accept you. And we come along, and in essence we say, what kind of standards do you have, God? I maybe don't know as much about myself as you do, but I can assure you this, I certainly can't accept myself. In other words, you have a higher standard than God? You know, the least you can do is agree with him. If he can accept you, how much more should you be able to agree with him that life is acceptable? You see, for you to accept yourself as you are will enable you to change whatever needs changing in your life. Do you believe that? You can't hate it out. You can't drive it out. The beginning of it is going to have to begin with acceptance. It's me. And if God hasn't written me off, what right have I to write me off? The next step in the pyramid is trust. And trust is when you allow yourself to be what you are. See, you're starting to project now. To communicate, understand, and accept, that's homework. Trust now gets to the point where you are able to let yourself be you, to begin expressing yourself. Only when you are able to allow yourself to be what you are, only then will you be able to allow others to be what they are. We're always so busy in this world trying to change people because we don't trust them. We don't like them quite the way they are. The interesting thing is that when we do get finished with the change each time, we still aren't satisfied. Reminds me of the couple that came in for counseling, and first I met with her, and she said, my husband didn't like my hairstyle. It was long. He said, all you are is just old-fashioned. So she said, I cut off a little bit, and he said, well, at least you're getting a little close. So she said, I cut it off and got my hair short, and then he said, well, now you sure are getting fancy about it, aren't you? What are you trying to do, attract other men? And she said, by that time I couldn't grow the hair back on. She said, I tried it 3 different lengths and found out that I still wasn't acceptable to him. Then when I met with him later on in a counseling session, he said to me, he said, if my wife could just make up her mind if her hair should be long, short, or whatever it should be, but he said, it drives me out of my mind that she can't make up her mind. You see, now here were people trying to change each other on the false premise that if the other person would do the right thing, I could be happy, and it doesn't come that way. Only when we can allow others to be what they are and we can allow ourselves to be what we are, only then can we together begin moving toward what you can and what you want to be. Can you hear what I'm saying through all of this? I'm saying this. Uptight people can't change anything in their life, and they are totally ineffective with others because they're always trying to change others. Our purpose in life is to be natural, to be real. And when we can bring this atmosphere where we are relaxed, things happen, things fall in place. That brings us to the next step in the pyramid, you see. That's love. Love is when you're able to reach out, to embrace all of yourself at all times. How beautiful. When Jesus summarized the 10 Commandments, he said that we should love the Lord our God, in Matthew 22. Then he went on to say something very interesting. Love your neighbor as yourself. Both times he used the word love to express the divine qualities of love. Now, many sermons have been preached on how to love a neighbor, but I haven't heard many sermons, if any, on how to divinely love ourselves. Love begins at home. Sanctification begins at home. Walking with Jesus begins at home, with me personally. I can't spread it out into the world if I don't have it with me. What can we say about divine love? I jotted down just a few things, and let me present them to you this way. First of all, divine love is reasonable. It's very reasonable. It just doesn't ask for the unusual, the absurd. Divine love is reasonable. It puts life within reach. Second thing I can say is that divine love has understanding. You aren't perfect, but love can understand that. In fact, real love is so realistic, it doesn't expect you to be. Apply that to a marriage. Can a husband love his wife because she's perfect? A lot of people live that way, and thus can never really come through with love because the wife isn't perfect or the husband isn't perfect. Divine love has understanding and says, it's not perfect. It won't be. It doesn't have to be. That's a story of grace, and that's a story of gracious living. There's understanding. Divine love is patient. It can wait. There's time. You aren't what you should be, neither am I, but we can wait. That's a quality of divine love. Divine love can forgive. It's forgiving in every scene of life. You know, I believe that what makes divine forgiveness divine is that it can also forget. Divine love is comprehensive. It doesn't love just a part of you. It loves all of you. I tack this last one on because I believe it's a whole topic in itself. Divine love is healing. You know, when you're in an atmosphere of acceptance, where people trust you, you just don't have headaches and ulcers and nervousness. There's healing in it, and I've often thought if the Christian community, the church, could become what God intended it to be, what a healing community it would be, especially when doctors quote such percentages as 70, 80, even 90% of the people who come, who claim to have physical ailments, have nothing but psychosomatic or emotional problems where they vent it out in a physical complaint. What healing there would be. What a change there would be in the whole medical world as well as the psychological world when you consider its healing. The next page I'm going to plant a very simple little illustration in your mind. When you were a child, there was the parent, and you were the child. In other words, they were the big people and you were the little people. How the parents felt toward you, the child, largely determined how you felt toward yourself. On the next page, but when you became an adult, you became a parent to yourself. Now don't miss that connection. So at this point, there is something like a little child within you. How you treat that little child within yourself will determine how willingly that little child or your feelings will work for you. Love is a motivator, not a manipulator. It's a motivator. If you love and accept yourself, it's just like the springs of life well up within you. And life is interesting, and life is filled with things to do and the pleasure of doing it. But if we're critical toward ourselves, condemning and unforgiving, it's just like taking a little child and whipping the spirit of life out of him. On page 28, I would like to point you to a very beautiful passage of Scripture. In Matthew 11, it says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." In other translations it says, "Take my yoke upon you. The way is easy." So many Christians feel that when you become a Christian, you really have the load on you now. But do you realize that the average Christian expects more of himself than God does? Think about it. This is why so many Christians fail in grace and are consumed in guilt. There's a song I have heard sung many times that has a line in it like this: "If just a cup of water I place within your hand, then just a cup of water is all that I demand." And how many Christians aren't hard on themselves, that if all they have is a cup, they feel like they should have given a gallon. If $1 is all they have for the offering, they shame themselves for not having 10. If 1 talent is all themselves, they feel disgraced for not having 2. But remember this: God never asks of you what you cannot give or what He has not already given you. To conclude our topic, I'd like to make the suggestion to you that you would make a list sometime soon of your good qualities and your bad qualities. Now, if you really know yourself, you will be able to name an equal number of each. When you finish making this double list, put a circle around it and write in big letters on it, "This is me." Now pick the qualities that you love the least. Apply the pyramid principle to it of love and acceptance. And you will find that as you are able to love and accept yourself as a total person, it will enable you to make the changes in your life you have so long desired. Hatred deepens. Love changes. Of all the people in the world that you have ever tried to love, have you ever loved yourself? If you want to love what God loves, and if you are His child, and wish to start with the closest person in the world, you start with self. I'm going to ask you to close in prayer with me, and before I do, I'm going to ask you a very important question. It's found in the first few verses of John 5, a simple little scene. A man who had been a paralytic for 38 long years. When Jesus met him, the man was so excited about telling the story of how long he had been lying there, he was successful in his failure and was drawing all the attention he wanted. And you would almost think that that man would certainly want to be healed, but Jesus asked him a very important question, and He said to him, "But would you like to be whole?" And I can hear the man say again, "But I've been here for 38 years, and when the angel comes, no one here is to help me." And all this, and Jesus said to him, "But would you like to be whole?" That's the question I leave with you. You say you can't love yourself? I like to ask you this. But would you like to be changed? Let's pray. Lord, enable me to value myself the way you do. Forgive me for the ways I have treated myself in the past. Help me to see myself with the same understanding that you do. And thank you for the new possibilities you offer to me in life through your grace. Amen.